Here we are again. So we're having this midterm test, and what I'm going to do is later this afternoon, I'm going to send out the test. And I guess I'll make the deadline. I said Monday, but let's make it Tuesday at noon. Hand in your paper by Tuesday at midday at noon. Any questions about this? 2 out of 3 of the review questions. Any questions? Okay, very good. So today we're going to see the full involvement of the United States. At last, we're at the point where the Americans go in whole hog. They're going to win this this conflict and demonstrate that they can contain China and also deal with third world revolutionary movements. Before I start, I just wanted to say a little bit more about this whole question of civilization, which was the basis of this little essay that you composed. The reason I'm harping on that, I did, is that, I wanted to make the point that the French were guilty of ethnocentrism. That is to say, they regarded only European, and especially French culture as civilization. Everything else was not civilized. And of course, they were deeply wrong. The truth is that East Asian civilization, particularly Chinese civilization, is millennia old. And Vietnam was an offshoot of that. And certainly by about 1,000, they had their own state and they had all the attributes of a civilization. That's the point I made last time. But there's a further point, and that is that, and this is somewhat controversial, but I think that what I'm about to say is increasingly people are aware of this. In a way, this conflict that we see, it's a conflict between the United States and in Korea and in Vietnam, but ultimately China is what the United States are resisting, and of course it's ongoing, in fact intensifying. The truth of the matter is that this very old civilization, which in terms of ancient history and medieval history, insofar as there were global relations, China was the biggest state. It had the largest population. It had the most developed economy. It had the most sophisticated state bureaucracy. It was only after 1500, and particularly in the 18th century, that China, owing to the intrusion of the West and certain internal contradictions, lost this primacy. And my argument would be is what we're seeing today is that China is back. China is coming back after 2 or 3 centuries. China's primacy in the world is reasserting itself. And this is what the United States and the West has to contend with. And so what we're seeing, a civilizational change is what I'm talking about, a civilizational change. That is to say, the West is in relative decline and the East is rising, particularly China is rising. And it's going to be a rough road ahead, even people getting their minds around this. Look at the way the Canadian government has behaved. Obviously, their arms are twisted, but nevertheless, we can see that the West is having difficulties sort of dealing with this new reality. Any comments that you might have about what I've said? Some people might find this challenging. Anything you want to say? Okay, I guess you're accepting my ideas. without any, well, you're having your own thoughts, let's put it that way.
Actually, I got
So,
a question. Sorry.
yes,
So you said the West was in decline, but didn't you also say that the U.S. was at its peak at the point when all this happened?
the war in Vietnam.
Well, no. I meant like, well, because this was like after World War II, right? You said that was at the
Yes,
peak
there,
of
I
U.S.
said in many, and I mean, there's a common consensus that the United States was absolutely at its peak during the 60s. Its economy was still, it was slipping a bit, but still very competitive. American, in every aspect, including American culture, it was absolutely worldwide dominant in the 60s. And we've seen a kind of gradual sort of decline, breakdown. I can't go into this, but that's what's happened since then. Anything else you wanted to say, anybody? Okay, so let's get back to the narrative. And I'll pick it up in 64. Gem is gone, but the situation is very shaky in South Vietnam. In the countryside, the insurgency is gathering momentum. The first Pavin's troops have entered from the north, and the political crisis in Saigon is continuing. There are successive coups going on. The Buddhists are making all sorts of trouble. So the situation is very shaky. And in response to this, the Americans, well, one thing I mentioned was they sponsored the secret naval marine operations off the coast of North Vietnam. American ships offloaded ARVN troops, and they attacked various military operations north of the 17th parallel. There wasn't any real impact from this, but nevertheless, they did that, sort of to help shore up the South Vietnamese and to warn the North Vietnamese. But more seriously, through the Canadians, they sent an ultimatum to Hanoi in the spring of 64, saying that unless you desist from your infiltration and this insurgency, you will bear the brunt of a major escalation of the conflict. And the North Vietnamese responded by a total rejection and basically said that they would carry on the war to reunify all of Vietnam, and they would support the National Liberation Front until the end, till victory. Then after that, in the summer, in the beginning of August, came the Tonkin Gulf incidents. It is supposed there were 2 attacks by North Vietnamese speedboats, torpedo boats, against the US destroyer, the Maddox. And this attack led, these attacks, which some are questioned by some historians, seriously questioned. Nevertheless, the second attack occurred on the 4th of August, and the next day, Johnson ordered the first air attack on North Vietnam. And the same day, he sent to the American Senate a resolution for adoption by the US Senate. And I want to read to you the main elements of this Tonkin Gulf resolution, because it became the legal basis. And you'll see that the Seattle Pact is invoked. Remember that the Seattle Pact provided a legal justification for the defense of South Vietnam. Well, this is invoked by the Tonkin Gulf resolution. So it was passed on the 7th of August, 1964, and its title was to promote the maintenance of international peace and security in Southeast Asia. And it begins, whereas naval units of the communist regime in Vietnam, in violation of the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and of international law, have deliberately and repeatedly attacked United States naval vessels lawfully present in international waters. The Maddox and several other of these ships were cruising in the Gulf of Tonkin. They were, to be sure, in international waters, but they were offloading the South Vietnamese troops to attack installations in North Vietnam. So, but the resolution doesn't mention any of that. It just says U.S. naval vessels were cruising in international waters. And have thereby created a serious threat to international peace. In other words, the Maddox has been attacked. Whereas these attacks are part of a deliberate and systematic campaign of aggression that the communist regime in North Vietnam has been waging against its neighbors, and the nation joined with them in the collective defense of their freedom. In other words, the insurgency in South Vietnam, and we're not mentioning this, but there were similar things going on in Cambodia and Laos. North Vietnam is basically behind all of this. Well, I would say that to some measure that is true. To some measure that's true. Because if Hanoi didn't want these things to happen, they would have not happened. Well, in any case, whereas the United States is assisting the peoples of Southeast Asia to protect their freedom and has, get this, no territorial, military, and political ambitions in the area, but desires only that these people should be left in peace to work out their own destinies in their own way. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that the Congress approves and supports the determination of the President as Commander-in-Chief to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. The United States regards as vital to its national interest and to world peace the maintenance and security of Southeast Asia, consonant with the Constitution of the United States and the Charter of the United Nations, and in accordance with its obligations under the SATO Pact. The United States is therefore prepared, as the President determined, to take all necessary steps, including the use of armed forces, to assist any member or protocol state of the SATO Pact requesting assistance in defense of its freedom. So basically, what we can say is this is a blank check that is given by the Congress. And the Tonkin resolution was voted almost unanimously by, in particular, the US Senate. Well, I said almost unanimously because two senators, Gruning of Alaska and Wayne Morse of Oregon, voted against the Tonkin resolution. And Wayne Morse, in a speech as it was passed, commented as follows. We are in effect giving the president war-making powers in the absence of a declaration of war. I believe that to be a historic mistake, meaning a very significant mistake. And in fact, this resolution in '64 was actually rescinded by the Congress in 1971, when the lid blew off, when all support for the war in Vietnam had collapsed within the United States. The Congress saw fit to rescind the Tonkin Gulf resolution. And basically, many of the senators said we were tricked into this resolution. But I guess the point is that and the United States had intervened militarily in several places since World War II without getting a declaration of war. Partly this was done to sort of avoid escalating the Cold War into a hot war, but I think part of it was done in order to sort of avoid having the full glare of public opinion to spotlight on these events, because if a declaration of war is a serious step, and it would have obviously, the public was distracted. They didn't know what was really going on. So it was a way you could get something underway without really putting the full glare of public opinion on what you were doing. Now, in terms of the election, and there's always elections, 64 was a presidential election year. Barry Goldwater, who was a complete hawk, extremely aggressive. His idea was nuke the gooks. He was the Republican candidate, and Johnson posed as a peace candidate. Yet, when Goldwater now attacked him, he pointed to this resolution saying, "No, I'm going to be tough." And so Goldwater had basically to keep quiet. So this took the force out of the Republican insistence on more aggressive activity. But the other side, Hanoi, they simply answered by stepping up the insurrection and the insurgency in the South and sending increasing numbers of PAVN troops, People's Army of Vietnam, regular troops, now began to push into parts of South Vietnam. And the situation politically didn't get any better because the political confusion, the Buddhist crisis, and the constant plotting by the generals, coup after coup, no stable government. The situation was really collapsing politically in Saigon. And so by the end of November, after the election in 64, Johnson, his advisors, and I explained that generally these advisors were confident that an American involvement would lead to victory. They basically called for the regular bombing of North Vietnam. Johnson had acted in the Tonkin Gulf incident, but now they said to Johnson, in order to shore up Saigon, to boost morale, that Johnson had to authorize regular bombing of North Vietnam. And if he did so, McNamara and the others basically assured Johnson, well, it would work. And the United States Air Force could inflict unacceptable damage on the North. The United States would punish the North by bombing, and at some point, the North would get the message and desist from its so-called invasion and insurgency. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the thinking in Washington, which is quite important to the way things proceeded. The idea, the key military strategic idea that the Americans had was the notion of gradual escalation as a means of fighting a war during the Cold War. Gradual escalation, that's the key term. This term emerged from the think tanks, the military strategic think tanks in the United States, the RAND Corporation in California, and in New York, there was something called the Hudson Institute. And basically, what these military strategists, these military intellectuals argued was that you want to avoid a full-scale confrontation with the Soviet Union. You want to avoid nuclear war. So in fighting the wherever it might happen, the case of Vietnam is the one we're dealing with, wherever the communists became aggressive in their designs, the way to respond to them was by gradual escalation. You begin to punish them militarily, but you start out with small steps, and then you, if they persist, you raise the ante. You constantly raise the ante, and at a certain point, the enemy will give way. The United States has the capacity, especially note the sort of quantitative aspect of this. They can measure all this, they think, on the computer. They can sort of raise the ante on the enemy to a certain point, and the enemy, if it feels enough pain, it will give way. And of course, this raises the point which right-wingers subsequently raised when escalation proved to be a failure and the war was lost. The right wing, and it's continued to do this, although these issues have somewhat faded, they basically said the problem was gradual escalation. What the United States should have done was all-out war, and it should have invaded North Vietnam. If they had done that, if they had not pussyfooted, as they put it, but completely invaded North Vietnam and simply occupied it. Well, first of all, I mean, there's a question of whether it was militarily possible. It would mean all-out mobilization, and the government was not willing to contemplate that. But even more important was North Vietnam was an ally of China and the Soviet Union. And nobody could believe that the Soviet Union and China would not intervene on the side of North Vietnam. And that is what tied the hands of Johnson. He was always fearful that if he took a step too far, the Chinese and the Soviets, as it was, of course, what the Chinese and the Soviets did was they made up all the losses that the North Vietnamese suffered. That is to say, they began to send billions and billions of dollars, not as much as the Americans invested, but nevertheless, billions and billions of dollars. And ultimately, the Chinese sent sort of logistical forces to create supply lines from China into North Vietnam to deliver aid to the North Vietnamese. The Americans bombed the whole of North Vietnam. They destroyed the infrastructure. They destroyed whatever industry they had. But the Chinese and the Soviets, and for that matter, the Polish communist government, the Czech communist government, the whole of East Europe provided aid to North Vietnam. It became really a cockpit between East and West, this war. And ultimately, I would say that there may have been well over 100,000 Chinese troops. They didn't enter the battlefield, but they were supporting logistically the North Vietnamese. And the Soviets, not only did they send planes to fight the American Air Force, but they sent pilots. There were Soviet pilots maintaining radio silence who flew missions against the American pilots. There were air duels between Soviet and American pilots over North Vietnam in the course of this fighting. Everything short of all-out war. In any case, by January 1965, it was clear that the American measures had not worked. The confusion politically in Saigon continued. And Therefore, Johnson's advisors said, we have to go into all-out air war. We have to escalate to the level of all-out air war against North Vietnam. And we just have to find the proper occasion to launch such an air war. That is to say, some incident. And we've seen the Tonkin Gulf incident. Now, the second incident, which comes on the 7th of February, 1965, is the so-called Pleiku incident. Pleiku is a little town in the Vietnamese highlands. You can see it right here. It's in Annam. And it's in a remote area in the uplands, in the highlands, surrounded by jungle. Well, the Americans built an air base at Pleiku. On the 7th of February, the National Liberation Front launched an attack, surprise attack on this air base, 7th of February, 1965. During this attack, 9 Americans were killed, 137 were wounded, and 22 helicopters and planes were destroyed by the National Liberation Front in this Pleiku incident. And therefore, again, as following the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, Johnson ordered a round of airstrikes in retaliation, airstrikes against the north of the country. But he didn't stop. This marks the real beginning of the air offensive, the American air offensive against North Vietnam. And this became known as Rolling Thunder. The operation against North Vietnam was called Rolling Thunder. It began in February 1965, and it continued until 1968, 3 years, all-out bombing of North Vietnam, day and night. Something like nearly 1 million tons of bombs were dropped on North Vietnam during this period. It, as I said previously, it destroyed virtually all the infrastructure and industry in the north. But as I also said, the Chinese and the Soviets, etc., made up all the losses. And furthermore, coming back to what I said in an earlier lecture, North Vietnam had undergone a process of development, economic and social development, in the period between the end of the French War and the beginning of this American War. And although the industry was lost, the capacity, the human capacity, the ability to basically handle machinery, to medically care for the population, the level of education had all developed in North Vietnam to the point where the People's Army of Vietnam was a modern army, and of course it was equipped and re-equipped by the Chinese and the Soviets. And so the North Vietnamese Army, the PAVAN, was a formidable force. And so the North Vietnamese respond to the American air bombing by basically sending more and more of these regular troops. They had millions and millions of people who were, I wouldn't say that all of them were gung-ho. When you read the novel by this novelist from Hanoi, it's one of the books that you're reading, you can see that this guy has serious second thoughts about the war. That's certainly something that you need to take in. Obviously, people were frightened, and war was absolutely devastating and so on. But in general, I would say that the nationalism of the Vietnamese, including the insurgents in the South, was such that the leaders, the communist leaders, did have, well, they had the support of the people in the North, and they had the support of a considerable fraction of the people in the South. One of the features that emerges from 1965 onwards is the emergence of what we call the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Ho Chi Minh is the leader, right? And what you find is that from the north, you see this red line running south here. It actually runs in Laos. It runs through Laos, not directly in Vietnamese territory. It runs through Laos, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was hacked out of the jungle, became the main means by which the infiltration of North Vietnamese troops to the south was conducted. And from being basically a jungle trail, by the end of the war, it became a virtual highway down which trucks, bicycles, trucks brought millions and millions of tons of supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to say nothing of troops. And this is all basically developed by the peasants, peasant mobilization along the path of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Americans were going to try everything they could to sort of block it, but to no avail, as we'll see in a little bit of time. But this is the main conduit. Today, I might say this is a superhighway between North and South Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail still exists, but it is now like, I don't know, the route up to Gimli or something on the highway. That's what it looks like. It takes tourists from Hanoi down to Saigon and so on today. In any case, so the bombing campaign, Rolling Thunder. But in addition to the bombing of North Vietnam, the United States steps up bombing of South Vietnam. And as a matter of fact, the bombing of South Vietnam was much more basically directed against the National Liberation Front, was much more intense than the bombing of the North. The bombing of the North was bad, but what the Americans did in South Vietnam was horrific. They used Agent Orange, and I said half the forests disappeared through the use of this defoliant, which was cancer-causing stuff. It was used right through the American involvement in the war. They also used, of course, huge amounts whenever they found what they thought was a concentration of communist troops. They called in fighter bombers, and they used ample supplies of napalm, which sometimes fell on innocent people. And finally, in battle, the United States unleashed their fleet of B-52s, dropping a massive tonnage from 25,000 feet up on suspected enemy concentrations. It was so bad that many people in the countryside, the less stalwart, the less committed to the insurgency they were, well, they fled for their lives. And so what you find is, especially between 65 and 75, is a mass migration of the rural population, of many of the peasants who were just trying to escape death. They fled into the cities. And if you can believe it, an American political scientist, who I think is still around, Samuel Huntington, he described this euphemistically as forced modernization. Forced modernization. In other words, oh, we're just modernizing Vietnam by bombing them to smithereens. This was the overall situation. But finally, we can say that, and from the American point of view, one good thing did emerge, and that is a Vietnamese general, it turned out, and remember there was so many coups, 6 or 7. Finally, the last leader of a coup, his name was General Nguyen Van Tu. He turned out to be an effective political leader. And he took power in 65, and he made himself president, ultimately, of the country. He organized sort of a whole political structure which could support him, and he stabilized the Republic of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese government. There was somebody here that the Americans could deal with finally after they overthrew Diem. Now, that being said, nevertheless, these same advisors, McNamara, the Bundys, Rostow, they said, well, the bombing campaign is having a certain effect, but these damn North Vietnamese, they keep coming across the 17th parallel, and the insurgency doesn't stop. Particular to carry out the air war, we need to build more and more air bases in the country, and we need American troops to protect the air bases because the South Vietnamese army, the ARVN, is not reliable. So we need American ground troops. So from the air escalation, now we have the full-scale introduction of ground troops, and this is what I'm describing right now. Johnson is forced to agree. Yes, we need troops to protect our planes in South Vietnam, and so on the 8th of March, 1965, the first American troops, American Marines, landed at the port of Da Nang it's near the 17th parallel, up towards the north of South Vietnam. At Da Nang, here's the name, Da Nang. This was becoming a gigantic port. The Americans were building a gigantic port at Da Nang, and the Marines went into Da Nang in March of 1965. The other main port that the Americans built was closer to Saigon on the coast, Cam Ranh Bay. These are the two main ports that the Americans established. In any case, the first American troops arrived, and this was immediately followed 3 weeks later, on the 29th of March, 65, the NLF basically blew out the front of the American embassy in Saigon. And 20 people were killed and 100 injured in this terrorist attack on the US Embassy on the 29th of March, 1965. So Johnson, putting on a brave face, immediately, the 2nd of April, 1975, orders 20,000 more US infantry to go to Vietnam. And he calls for offensive operations by the Americans against the National Liberation Front. At this point, 2nd of April, 65, Johnson had committed, there had been a buildup Kennedy, there were 16,000. Well, now the troop level is at 33,000. Johnson orders in 33,000, total of 33,000 troops. Ultimately, the American commitment was to rise to, I believe the figure is 750,000 American troops were sent to Vietnam. Now, Johnson at this point, public opinion polls were taken. As this is what they do, of course, all the time. Public opinion polls showed that Johnson had overwhelming support. Yeah, this is necessary. We're going to do it. Now, can anybody explain to me why the American public supported this commitment? Why did they do this? Could you explain? What do you think?
It's possible that maybe the US was spreading lots of propaganda to its citizens about communism and they're fighting communism.
Yeah, absolutely. That's this had been going on since 1946 and repeated American involvements fighting communism. And I would say the image of victory in World War II. I think we underestimate the effect of this on the United States. And as a matter of fact, I would say that's true of Canada too. The ultimate solution internationally for the United States and Canada is military intervention. Let's mobilize and let's get the people behind us. We won back then and we can win, we can win, we can win. And I say this because it's going on right now. It's going on right now. What is the American response to the threat of China? The threat of, if there is a threat of China, it's an economic threat. It's a geostrategic threat. What is the American answer? What is the Canadian answer? Military buildup. This is invariably the way they answer. That's not an answer, not at all. But they're doing it anyway because the people at the top, this is the way they think. Now, Johnson had overwhelming support, but there were certain people who began to object. And here, what I'm describing is the early beginnings of the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement, which was to bring Johnson to his knees. What was that all about? Well, it started at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. What do they call the Big Blue or something in football terms? Ann Arbor, Michigan. A group of professors who, many of whom were specialists in East Asia and Far East, were horrified by what was going on. And they sponsored what they called a teach-in. They announced, and the students responded. Thousands of students participated in a teach-in at the U of M, which went on all night, and the professors explained what really was going on in Vietnam and how the United States, step by step, had become involved. And then this movement, in the next few days, spread to the University of California, Berkeley, and Harvard University, where more or less the same thing happened. And the policies of Washington were denounced. And this spread into a nationwide movement. In the next weeks, a national teach-in was organized, and a total of 122 universities participated in a radio hookup, where for hours, these scholars and so on, anti-war activists explained what was going on in Vietnam. So there was this protest movement that was beginning in the universities. The University of Manitoba was part of that hookup, I note for the record. And then on April 17th, a new organization, which was called the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, called for a demonstration against the war in Vietnam in Washington, a protest march. And that demonstration was small, only 17,000 participated in this demonstration. But this was the beginning of demonstrations which were to develop into demonstrations of millions and indeed tens of millions of Americans were to mobilize themselves in these anti-war demonstrations. Now, who participated in this? Well, first of all, we should mention the SDS itself. The SDS emerged basically out of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement had begun in the early 60s, Martin Luther King and so on. But by 64, the Black Power movement began to eclipse the civil rights movement. They continued conjointly, but of course the Black Power movement was revolutionary in its basically a view. The civil rights movement was reformist. Well, many of the members of the Students for a Democratic Society were veterans of the civil rights movement. And the second element here is the fact that it wasn't a question of civil rights. It was also protest against universities. The students began to mobilize against the universities. It started in Berkeley, California, but soon in first the elite universities and then the ordinary universities, the students began to complain, number one, that the universities were bureaucratic institutions. They were treating the students poorly. They were manipulating the students. And secondly, they were complicit. Their research was largely founded by the American military. And so on the campuses, the students began, it was mainly students, began to challenge the administrators, and the administrators got scared. So you have the civil rights movement, you have this protest at the universities, and then you have the growing hostility to the war in Vietnam. The more so as these young people felt themselves subject to the draft. Every American young male had to serve in the military. Well, they would be shipped off to Vietnam. And so that then, if we're looking for a material motive for protest on the part of the students, that was certainly it. Now, so the SDS was the main thrust. Now, the SDS was what we call the new left, because they said that they stayed completely clear of Stalinism, of the Soviet Union. They denounced they were against the Soviet Union and so on, but they were for Marxism. They were against imperialism, and I hope you sort of understand those things. But they were against Stalinism because you couldn't be for the Soviet Union in the United States in 1964. That was impossible. So the students kept clear, and they also believed in something that they call participatory democracy. That is to say, the Soviet Union was not democratic, but their kind of Marxism, they said, would lead to a deepening of democracy in American life. But there were what I would call Leninists also involved. Certainly the Communist Party participated, harassed and persecuted as it was, and the Trotskyists, they're always present. They also participated in this demonstration. So we'll see how this further unfolded on Monday. And of course, your deadline is Tuesday at noon for the exam. Any questions or